On Saturday, we're doing this cyborg project. My mother was big on science fiction. She was a computer programmer. I was exposed to that at a very young age. A lot of young people are exposed to comics and things like that in films and movies. So they often find science or find technology, engineering, and math in these references. So finding them is one way to bridge a gap. They recognize it's familiar to them, and then you use that as a way to bring something in that's maybe more new or different, or maybe even challenging or scary to students. And it's easier to sort of absorb and understand it when it's familiar at first. Some examples of cyborgs. I chose them because it reflects a lot of the students that I've taught. So a cyborg for DC Comics is an African American boy in some cases, or a man in some cases. It's in the current Justice League film that came out a couple of years ago. It's also a comic. So kids who are really into comics would know this character. And Forge is Native American and is Marvel, and it's one of the X-Men. And it was actually my Native American colleague who told me about Forge. It's like, don't forget Forge. Representation being as important as it is, but there's a reference to cyborg. He has a cyborg. He's a cyber. His leg is robotic, and I think he has another cyborg. Maybe his eyes. I can't remember. And then Alita Battle Angel is a film, but it's also based on a manga or something like that. And Robert Rodriguez did the film, and the character is very much. She seems Latina. She exhibits that when you watch the film, and that's because of the filmmaker. So we can look at students will recognize these characters, especially if they're really tuned into these popular culture, or in this case, comics or film. But this is a good starting point to begin to get them to sort of think about something familiar to them, but also start to introduce something like maybe biomechanics, or engineering or things like that, or technology. That's the first part. It's familiar now. Okay, you're speaking to me. So now I'm listening. Now I'm attentive. I'm paying attention. So now we want to. One activity that I love to do with students because you can do many layers. This is personal meaning mapping. It's also called concept mapping, learning mapping, but it's mapping. Mapping is a very common and culturally relevant activity. So in this case, as it relates to the idea of cyborg, I was looking for examples of real life cyborgs. And this particular story is one that's local to this place. This is a artist, actually a legend graffiti artist, Temp One from Los Angeles, who now has ALS and can only move his eyes. And it's been years since he's been that way. So a bunch of creative technologists, DIYers, and folks got together and created iWriter, which is a way for Temp One to continue to do graffiti using the movement of his eyes. So if we were to make this a project or something. This is a cyborg. We were to do a mapping project around that. We can begin to sort of draw the branches or the threads that come out from this project. So graffiti being one of them. Temp One is a legend in Los Angeles. It's part of a community. So he belongs already to a community, and he's also a legend and practiced graffiti artist. So all that knowledge, all that ability is still here in his head. Um, we also can talk about fashion accessories if you wanted to, is using some cheap glasses as a frame to hold the equipment. And you have to sort of have knowledge of physical computing, so electronics, things like that, to be able to put together iWriter. So that's a thread. And then biology, we can talk about ALS and what it does to the human body, and why he's not able to move anything but his eyes. And biomechanics is kind of where we would put iWriter, where in this case it's not body movement except for his eyes, but we could talk about Newton's laws of motion and things like that. We can get into some physics and things. So just at a quick glance, just to sketch out or draw out some examples of where we could go and directions we could go with this is a common mapping activity that I do with students. It's a good way to brainstorm. It's a good way to get them to think deeply about a particular project or a topic, and to sort of maybe find something that might be of interest to them. This is a way to unpack the backpack. Mm-hmm. So it's not me as a teacher coming saying, you have to do, here's a worksheet, and in 20, in a half an hour, turn it in, do the next thing. It's a different approach, but it's an inclusive approach. But the real important part is not the making; it's actually this part. It's getting them engaged at the beginning.
Yeah, we're making it more useful. I just tried it on. Yeah, we're making it more useful. I just tried it on.
I really push for upcycling. I really push for using things. So I bring a robotic hand that moves, but it's made with some box I found on the street and some Dunkin' Donuts straws that I found on the street. It's washed off and cut and used. I want them to begin to think about their environment, and also thinking about, you don't necessarily have to have a lot of money or a lot of resources to do these projects. The ability to think on your, okay, here's a problem we need to solve, and they found a creative way to do that. So you want to instill that in them by using found materials. They have to think a little bit outside, or give them a challenge. Here's some found materials, but you can't use tape or glue. How can you get things to attach without having to use some, so now you have to be a little more creative about really pushing them to think outside the box, but still learning what they need to learn.